said is about the pre-Apollo spaceflight programs like Sputnik and Gemini and all that. So my presentation was supposed to be on Sputnik. It was basically humans' first leap into a larger world. It was pretty technically limited. It was only able to burst like radio waves back and forth from Earth for a couple of weeks. The real goal the Russians wanted to have happen was sending something alive to space. And they did that with Laika, the dog, and yes, she would know. And then they sent Yuri Gagarin to space on April 12th, 1961. And on the next slide, I've got a cool quote from Yuri. And this quote really just shows that astronauts know better than everyone else. You see this, like, everything going on, and really silly to all of them. The next person's slide was Joe, and he had the Mercury missions. It was the Americans' first manned spaceflight program, but of course the Soviets beat them to it. So Mercury ran from 1958 to 1963, and John Carpenter. The picture itself here is John Carpenter walking the Mercury Atlas 7 on May 24th, 1962. These are the astronauts who were a part of the Mercury program. You have, from front left to right, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, excuse me? Schirra. Deke Slayton, John Glenn, and Scott Carpenter, and back left to right, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and Gordon Cooper. They all went on to later space missions, including Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle. Gus Grissom died in the Apollo 1 fire, which will be covered later, in 1969. Deke Slayton was part of the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. John Glenn became the oldest man in space when he flew on the Space Shuttle the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1998. This was pretty much the game plan of Mercury, was to send a man into space and land him back home safely. It wasn't really that ambitious. He just sent him up and hoped he fell back down and didn't die. They didn't send him that long. Like, as it says here, it's only 199 nautical miles. That's only about 220 actual miles. The capsules themselves were pretty limited. They only carried enough food, water, and oxygen for one day. But something cool about them is the couches, they're perfectly conformed to your body, so couldn't really complain about that. Next spaceflight program we've got here is Project Gemini. It was the spaceflight program between Mercury and Apollo, so basically the next step onward. The objective was to pave the way to successfully dock two spacecraft and put a man on the moon. These are the new astronauts who were part of the Gemini program. The back row is made of McDivitt, Lovell, White, and Stafford. And the front row is Conrad, Borman, Armstrong, and Young. On Gemini 4, Ed White became the first American to go out on a spacewalk.
The Russians did it before us.
So, yep, sorry.
Okay.
They didn't?
Okay.
You did it.
Oh, I'm sure we did in the 80s somewhere, right? When
Well,
was it?
I thought no, I'm pretty sure that the Russians had the first extravehicular activity.
I don't know.
The main goal of the
That was not that important after that. We were the first men in space.
Okay, anyway, the main goal of the Gemini program was to dock two spacecraft in space. It's really hard to do. It's like you and your buddy throwing a rock and a tennis ball on opposite sides of the house and hitting them perfectly. So That's a quote from Earth to the Moon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. So I've got a video here of that process.
While we're watching this, should I say my piece?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so when we first were planning to go to the moon, the idea was, how do you get them there and have enough fuel to return? And so part of the idea was is we would orbit the Earth with all of our stuff and then go to the moon, but the mathematics of it just didn't work out, the economics of it just didn't work out. And so what they decided to do instead was launch everything to the moon. And
Orbit the
keep-
moon.
Yep, and so we're gonna go and orbit the moon, and we're gonna separate the spacecraft, so we're gonna have our command module and our lander, or the LEM. And so the command module will continue to orbit, and that's where the fuel is for the return flight. And so you orbit the moon, and all you have to do is let gravity do its thing there. Then you separate the command module and the LEM goes down and lands. And then when the LEM blasts off, it leaves part of its contraption down there. The LEM blasts back off, and now you have to get your LEM and your command module to redock so the astronauts that landed on the moon can get back to Earth in the command module.
So that's why they did Gemini.
So that's what
Basically.
Gemini was, and so that's what this video is showing, is a little bit of that, they call it rendezvous and docking. And so they would separate, they just did this in Earth orbit. They would separate and come back together and just practice. Because like you were saying in class, the trick of it is,
Getting two people to throw a rock and a
yeah,
tennis ball across
and
the
it's,
house.
you know, it's not just like backing up your truck to your trailer, because we
Yeah.
have three dimensions that we have to deal with. And so it's a lot more tricky than just hooking up the boat. So they call it lunar orbit and rendezvous.
I can't find the TV here. What's going
Turn it
on?
on and off, your Wi-Fi on and on.
Well, that was basically it anyway, so,
Okay. So a
Alright.
little bit about, okay.
Yep.
So you're,
I think I'm good.
okay. So in the meantime, while all this is going on, we also have some unmanned missions. And I guess I thought maybe we were gonna do those first, weren't we?
Yeah,
Yeah, oh well, I screwed up.
it's all good.
So we had the very first unmanned missions,